Hello, y'all. So, let me get situated. Start to share my screen. Okay. So, for this first lecture video, I figured I would introduce the field of anthropology, define it, and then also cover some major perspectives within the field, all discussed in your textbooks. So, without further ado, um, the origin of anthropology encompasses where it comes from, right? And it's important to know where we draw certain terms from. So, the term anthropology is from the new Latin word anthropologia, or the study of humanity, stated differently. It shares the origin with the Greek word anthropos, human being. Um, ology, which is a part of anthropology here, the last part of that word, is commonly used in the English language to denote to a field of study. So anthropology, psychology, sociology, all fields of study there that have that ending ology there. Logos in Latin means explanation, so meant to explain something. Anthropology is meant to explain human species and humanity overall. Um, so, Anthropology is defined as an academic discipline that studies humanity from a broad biological and cultural perspective. Cultural anthropology is also known as sociocultural or social anthropology. This studies contemporary and historical recent human societies and culture here. And these definitions can all be found in your textbook. There are four subfields to anthropology. You have physical and biological, you have archaeological, or archaeology, cultural, and then anthropological linguistics, which I'll be defining each of these in the following slides. Um, so, if you want to further learn about what anthropology is and kind of get a second perspective and second kind of, person to say these definitions to further help you out here if you're struggling, I highly recommend this creator's videos. This video can be found on YouTube. He essentially just defines the term anthropology and goes through it. I also post this video on Canvas as a sort of resource on top of my lectures. So, starting off first with the first subfield of anthropology is the physical and biological anthropology, which focuses on anatomy and behaviors of animals. And this includes humans. This looks at the physical genetic variations in humans and non-human animals. And again, behaviors and anatomy here. So behaviors could be really anything in what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? So for example, how we talk with our hands as human beings, or our facial expressions, the fact that we smile and when we smile. Human beings, we tend to smile at things we enjoy. We tend to smile at other people when we introduce ourselves, right? It is something that is viewed as more positive for humans, smiling, as opposed to other non-human animals. They view smiling as a form of aggression or a threat. And so, how we view certain behaviors changes as humans. It changes from culture to culture, and it changes from humans to non-humans in how we view certain expressions, which is all important within the field of physical and biological anthropology. Physical and biological anthropology also traces the biological evolution of the human species and kind of highlights the historical significance of this evolution here. Primatology is a part of physical and biological anthropology. Primatology is essentially the study of the evolution, anatomy, and adaptation and social behavior of primates. Again, highlighting behavior here. For biological anthropologists who really explore the field of primatology, they would record and study and observe the behaviors of certain primates, like chimpanzees. And so, for example, physical anthropologists researched and observed African chimpanzees and found that these chimpanzees utilize tools, so sticks, to probe holes and in termite mines to find food resource and to eat these termites. And essentially, what they're highlighting here, physical anthropologists or biological anthropologists here are highlighting here is the aspect of and the usage of tools by these specific primates and how they are utilizing tools the same way that human beings utilize tools, which is very interesting. So all humanity belongs to a single species. This species is known as what? I realize I'm kind of asking that question to a no one at this moment, but to whoever is watching this video. But okay, you figure out the answer and you write it down. Um, but an evolution in differences in skin color, body type, facial form, height, etc., is all in reference to human variation here. And then physical and genetic similarities among people far outweigh differences. So, for anthropologists, is very crucial to the field. For anthropologists, they more so want to highlight similarities and physical and genetic similarities among humans, because for the longest time, historically speaking, early anthropologists more so highlighted differences um, among people. And they highlighted these differences and established these differences first and foremost through racial differences. And they really highlighted this for a long, long time until some crucial anthropologists kind of came out of the woodworks and said, no, 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 we have more similarities among each other than we do differences. And I think that's very, very crucial to the field of anthropology. And it's important to highlight that fact. Archaeology investigates the human past through excavating and analyzing material remains. Um, Part of this is prehistoric and historic archaeology, so looking at prehistoric times as well as historic archaeology. And part of this process is looking at old school documents and material. Prehistoric is looking at and analyzing prehistoric people, what they use. So, what not only looking at these types of people, prehistoric people, but also the types of tools they used. So the types of materials they use, the types of weapons that they use, the types of tools they use to help them out during their time. Historic, more so, is the documents and excavating specific documents. So supplements historic documents by excavating houses, stores, plantations, factories, etc. And so historic archaeology really highlights the aspect of looking at specific historical documents, especially tied to specific historical sites, like plantations, like factories, and the like here. And what's important here is that anthropologists who work within archaeology and kind of want to research prehistoric people or research historic archaeology, that's what they do. They look at the material aspects of that particular culture as well as old school documents to learn more about those people during that time. And that's important to highlight about archaeology here. Cultural anthropology is It studies firsthand and reports about ways of living by human groups, including indigenous peoples and people who live in modernized industrialized nations. What's important here, above all else, is it looks at people in their day-to-day environments. Cultural anthropology simply questions how people function. Um, in their environments and what they do, what they utilize, what their culture looks like, what they do on a day-to-day basis, how they conduct themselves. Um, and they further, for cultural anthropologists, they conduct this research through field work. So, what this means is that researchers go into the field where people live and where their environments are, and they simply observe and collect information from those sites and from those particular cultures. Stated differently, cultural anthropologists will go to specific sites to observe people in their given environments. And they record that in field journals, which is something that you will be doing this semester for this class. Um, so cultural anthropology is also, it involves a written account of how human populations live. Um, and part of this is highlighting ethnography, which is a method that's part of cultural anthropology and it's part of field work here. So, ethnography is simply a written account of how human populations live. It is very much tied to field work and how cultural anthropologists conduct research. Um, and so, for to conduct ethnographic field work, you have to keep a field journal and you have to kind of record what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. And I'll get more into this methodology later in the class. I'm just kind of like throwing terms at you at this moment. And so you take some time, chew on these terms, learn them, look them up in your textbook. And I'll, of course, have some concrete explanations as this course continues. Anthropological linguistics is concerned with the complex relationship between language, human behavior, and thought. Stated differently, anthropological linguistics really highlights language here and how language can be an expression of culture. Um, and furthermore, you language can also be an expression of our human behavior and how we conduct ourselves, and how we think on a day-to-day basis. And that's really, really important to the field of linguistics. So, some questions that anthropological linguistics might ask is how might language be a tool? Is it a tool? Could it be a tool for specific cultures and for specific people? And how, for us, do we use our own language as a tool in many ways? How do individuals like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders utilize language in specific speeches? Could they utilize language, right? And then what about different subcultures and people of different social categories, like ethnicities or people who are specific to different subcultures or subgroups, like LGBTQIA people? How do they utilize language? Um, and I ask these questions because they're very important to linguistics, and I'll get more into this when we discuss language and how language ties to culture. But what I will say is that for specific subgroups, they have specific lingos or different terms that they use, right? And that's found within their specific subgroup. Stated differently, they develop their own language. They develop ways of communicating with one another, ways that kind of it takes a while for outsiders, like maybe you and me, to understand that specific language. Maybe we might have to be a part of that subgroup to further understand that language. And so that's what linguistics are really, really highlighting here, or can highlight here within anthropology. And further, what's another important term, another important point to highlight here in how language can be a tool is that it's used as a message, similar to art, and how art is a form of culture and can be a form of a message, right? Being sent out to send a message for a specific thing, right? Language is the same thing. It's meant to convey something. It's meant to send across something. It's meant to communicate something. And it's at its baseline, that's what makes it a part of culture, right? It helps to connect people to each other in a variety of ways. And again, I'll get more into that on a recon on language. So, as I mentioned in the intro video, you have a field journal that you keep. For this field journal, um, you will have different prompts throughout the weeks. And maybe I might give you those prompts, maybe you come up with your own prompts. But for the most part, I'll help you through this field journal. So for your first entry, I want you to kind of cover these discussion questions that I have laid out throughout this first presentation. So, for this first discussion question, I ask you to reflect upon this question. Can cultures be defined as good or bad? Should cultures be defined as good or bad? Why or why not? And really expand upon this discussion question. If we were in a physical class, I would ask you in person, and you would answer back to me, and you would share with your classmates. Of course, you can't do that. And so take some time, reflect in your field journal on this specific discussion question. And and important to note, um, you will have to turn in your field journal at the end of the semester. So keep that in mind, and make sure you're keeping up with these prompts week to week. So there are specific applications of anthropology. You have applied anthropology, medical anthropology. You also have different perspectives within anthropology. So, for the applications, applied anthropology is a subfield applying anthropological perspectives, theories, empirical knowledge of cultures and methods to help assess and solve real world problems. Stated differently, this type of anthropology is meant to be, it's in the word, it's meant to be applied, right? In different fields and different practitioners. And it's meant to solve something or answer something. This is where anthropology comes in contact with more of the real world issues, right? Um, in terms of being found within governmental agencies, private organizations, employment, practitioner work, right? This is where you can find this subfield of anthropology, as opposed to medical anthropology, which is a specialization that researches the connections between cultural beliefs and habits and spread and treatment of diseases and illnesses. And medical anthropology not only highlights the medical portion of this, obviously, but it also understands the historical relevancy of understanding the aspect and the spread of diseases and what we have seen in the past historically to kind of prevent future spreading of specific diseases. And it looks at, again, the historical relevancy of this as well as the social context here, right? And how diseases continue to be spread and specific illnesses continue to be spread. Anthropological perspectives, there are three anthropological perspectives here discussed in your textbook. And these perspectives will, of course, become important with your final paper. You have holism or holistic, comparative, and cultural relativism. Holistic is an approach or assumption that any aspect of a culture is integrated with other elements. Stated differently, culture is not singular. Rather, holistic perspective understands culture to be nuanced and complex in a variety of different ways. Stated differently, we just can't simply explain a culture through one sentence, right? Because it's too complex for that. Um, so no single aspect of culture should be explored without further exploring other aspects of culture. Um, taken in kind of a sort of unique way, right? You can't just look at, for example, American culture without understanding how American culture has been impacted by various other cultures in a variety of different ways. Because in many ways, America is considered a melting pot of society. And so, stated differently, we tend to take on different cultures. And that impacts us in a variety of different ways. And so we can't just highlight American culture without also highlighting other cultures alongside it and how those other various cultures have impacted us. That's just one example of this. Comparative perspective asks, for example, are humans innately aggressive? Are nuclear families biologically based? Is the nuclear family rooted in our evolutionary past? Do men inevitably seek more sexual variety than women? Right? These might be some example of questions that comparative researchers within anthropology might want to ask. Essentially, comparative perspective wants to compare two or more cultures here. Um, and for example, a comparative perspective might be comparing American culture to Native American culture. And further understanding how Native American culture has impacted American culture in a variety of different ways, right? That could be an example of how you utilize comparative perspective here. Comparative perspective are valid generalizations about humans that consider a full range of cultural diversity. It helps to understand similarities and differences among humans across time and space. And so, with that previous example that I gave, right, it comparing and contrasting American culture to Native American culture, right? It also simultaneously highlights the importance of diversity within each of those cultures. So the significance and diversity of Native American culture alongside the significance and diversity of American culture and come kind of comparing and contrasting as well as highlighting how they communicate with one another, if that makes sense. Cultural relativism is another perspective, right? Your last perspective here out of three. It is the idea that one should not judge another's culture using the standards of one's own culture. I wish I had a whiteboard. Maybe I have a whiteboard. I'll figure that out later. But um, essentially, cultural relativism is the process it includes the process of ethnocentrism, where people might center their own culture as the universal culture here. And they might assume that their belief and moral values are superior than those of other beliefs and moral values. And they tend to center their own beliefs here over other people's beliefs. Cultural relativism really highlights this. Um, so, according to the previous textbook that I used for this class, I have a quote here. In studying another culture, do not evaluate the behavior of its members by the standards and values of your own culture. Um, that's a very important quote within cultural relativism because it highlights how important it is to not be biased, in other words, to not judge one's culture by your own cultural standards, because those cultures are separate from one another, and they're meant to be separate in many ways because they are diverse in many ways and they're complex. Furthermore, it's rarely seen successful to apply one culture to another culture because individual cultures are so diverse, historically speaking, that that cannot be done, right? Now you can explain how one has impacted another, historically speaking, but you cannot make the argument that one is superior over the other because of certain moral and belief standards that they might have. Because, as it's also highlighted within anthropology, morals shift and change from culture to culture. And so you might have a moral standard that you grew up with, but that moral standard might not be seen in another culture across the ocean, right? There might be a completely different moral standard that you can't really compare and contrast that to. I hope that makes sense. So, if you are looking for more information on cultural relativism here, as well as the strengths, weaknesses, and criticisms of this particular perspective, um, go on YouTube. I also posted this video from the same creator that I mentioned before, and he has a really good video on this particular perspective, and explains it in a different way that I do, which maybe that's more helpful. I don't know. So, take some further time, reflect in your field journal which perspective is the most interesting to you, which one you might use for your final project, stated differently. And of these, so which one is more interesting to you, and then further explain which one you might use for your final paper and apply to your final paper, and then why or why not you want to use that, right? And say take some time to answer these questions. Okay, so last to discuss here is kind of a brief review before I get into it of how anthropologists approach research. Um, so field research, again, is working in the field, being there physically, in person. Um, and then there are different approaches within field research that anthropologists might highlight. EDIC is an approach that emphasizes an outsider perspective and how it might be important to have an outsider perspective here. A culture, in other words, is analyzed from a perspective of an outside observer or researcher because sometimes being an outsider kind of lends some valuable perspective because you're kind of going into this culture blind, right? With your own background, and so you're kind of slowly introducing yourself to this new culture, and you're kind of like interacting with this new thing firsthand, day to day, which can be very, very beneficial to the field of anthropology. This differs from EMIC. This is an approach that is an insider's perspective. It looks at the beliefs, values, and practices of a particular culture from the perspective of the people who live within that culture. Very crucial. So it is stated differently. It takes it from the insider, right? It takes that perspective from the insider perspective, first-hand account, meaning that it's from the person who is in that culture and already part of that culture. And they have first-hand knowledge to those specific practices, values, beliefs, norms, the like here. Um, so, which approach, last discussion question here, which approach, edic or emic, should cultural anthropologists apply to their research when they're in the field? Why or why not? Why should they apply edic over emic or emic over edic? Should they? Or stated or a separate question, should anthropologists utilize both here? And could it be helpful to kind of balance both of these when approaching your own field work? Um, so take a second, discuss that, reflect upon that. Last to note here is that, not to answer the question that I just asked, but anthropologists really highlight that. I'm going to stop sharing. So anthropologists really highlight the balance of both here. So the balance of Edic and emic. So being kind of like an outsider to a certain degree, but also getting that insider knowledge in specific ways. So embedding yourself and being able to bed yourself within that culture, right? And so kind of getting a balance between being an insider, being an outsider, right? Because both are very, very beneficial and have their positives and negatives. Okay, I'll continue discussing this with my next lecture video. So have a good day, and I'll just end it here.